There are archives that hold more than just images of the past. They hold silent testimonies to events that official history prefers to ignore. Within them, we find a whole series of photographs, mostly dated between the 1840s and 1860s, although the reliability of these dates is highly questionable. These images, discovered in various collections around the world, share a single, startling anomaly. One so profound, it forces us to question the very fabric of our known reality. They depict magnificent cities with glorious architecture, paved streets, and complex structures, but they are completely lifeless. The streets, squares, and embankments are captured in a deafening silence, as if time itself has stopped. There is not a single person, not one horse-drawn carriage, not even a bird in the sky, nor a stray dog or cat on the cobblestones. No sign of any living creature. This is not just an early morning or a poorly chosen moment for a photograph. This is a picture of a total, all-encompassing absence of life. As you look at the impeccable facades of the buildings, you notice the empty sockets of their windows. Many are missing their glass, suggesting long-term abandonment. These are not cities asleep, waiting for dawn. They are worlds frozen after some great tragedy, long since deserted by their inhabitants. In the 19th century, city life happened on the streets. So where are the signs of that life? Where are the market stalls and merchant stands that should have filled the central squares? Where are the horses tied up, waiting for their owners, the barrels of water, the firewood or coal stacked against the walls? There isn't even laundry hanging on lines between the houses. The cities appear sterile, cleansed not only of people, but of all the trappings of their daily activities. Chimneys are clearly visible on the rooftops, but no smoke rises from any of them, a sign that there was no warmth, no life in the hearths below. The vegetation is either completely absent or consists of very thin, young trees. Their trunks look as if they were planted just a few months ago in bare, cleared earth. Inevitably, the most logical and simple explanation comes to mind. Perhaps it was all due to the primitive photography of the era. It's widely believed that the first cameras required very long exposures, sometimes up to 10 minutes, and could only capture stationary objects. Any movement, a person walking, a carriage rolling by, would simply fail to register on the photosensitive plate, leaving the streets hauntingly empty. At first glance, this theory seems convincing and answers all the questions. It elegantly explains the absence of people and animals, turning a profound mystery into a simple technical quirk. But if that's true, how do we explain other facts that completely contradict this neat theory? Before we build theories about a global cataclysm or a lost civilization, we must thoroughly investigate this technical aspect. It is here, in the details, that we may find the key to the mystery, or, conversely, an even greater contradiction that could shatter this simple, convenient explanation. The theory of imperfect camera technology seems, at first glance, like a lifeline of logic in a sea of inexplicable facts. It offers a simple, scientific-sounding explanation. The long exposure time needed for early daguerreotypes simply failed to capture moving objects. People, horses, carriages, anything in motion would become a transparent ghost and vanish from the final image, leaving only the stationary architecture behind. This theory is convenient because it allows us to dismiss the astonishing emptiness as a technical limitation of the era, thereby closing the book on uncomfortable questions. However, under closer, more critical examination, this seemingly solid argument begins to crumble under the weight of irrefutable contradictions and facts it cannot explain. The first and most powerful blow to this theory comes from other photographs taken in the very same historical period. Archivists and researchers are aware of numerous images that completely disprove the idea that capturing people was impossible. A prime example is the famous photograph of Abraham Lincoln's inauguration in 1861. In this image, a veritable sea of thousands of people spreads out before the Capitol. The figures are clearly visible. You can distinguish individual groups, hats, and silhouettes. While some may be slightly blurred, their presence is undeniable, creating a picture of a living, breathing event. And this is not an isolated case. There are other photos from the 1850s and 1860s that capture urban scenes with groups of people and carriages. If the photographic technology of the time was capable of capturing such massive crowds, why did other photographers, shooting the central squares of European and American capitals, produce completely dead landscapes? The suggestion that they deliberately used outdated and lower-quality equipment to photograph capital cities, while using advanced technology for reportage, seems absurd. Even if we momentarily accept that a camera with a colossal 10-minute exposure was used to create these mysterious, empty photos, we encounter another logical paradox. Moving objects would have disappeared, true. But urban life isn't just about movement. What happened to all the stationary objects? In the 19th century, streets were an extension of workshops, shops, and homes. Carts, after unloading goods, might stand for hours by warehouses. Market stalls and stands, once set up in the morning, would remain in place until evening. Horses tied to posts, chewing hay, barrels of goods, crates, sacks, building materials, all these objects would have been stationary enough to be clearly imprinted on a photo with any exposure time. Yet they are not in the pictures. The streets are not just devoid of people, they are sterile, clean of the slightest traces of their activities. No length of exposure can explain this. Finally, there's a technical detail that shatters the myth completely. In some of these empty photographs, you can see fountains. And astonishingly, the jets of water are captured. Yes, they look like a blurry, milky, ghostly cloud, which is the classic effect of shooting a moving object with a long exposure. The camera recorded the general position of the water flow over several minutes. But if the technology was capable of capturing constantly moving water, it should have, with the same inevitability, captured the smoke rising from the numerous chimneys. Smoke is a similarly slow-moving, shape-shifting object. Its plumes should have left the same blurry, ghostly traces against the sky in the photograph. But there is no smoke. Anywhere. This can only mean one thing. The chimneys were cold, the hearths were unlit, and the houses stood lifeless. The convenient technical explanation has crumbled to dust. We are now left with a much more disturbing reality. The streets really were empty. And so the question shifts from, how was this filmed, to, what on earth happened here? What force could have so totally and mercilessly emptied entire cities across the globe, leaving behind only their stone skeletons? Once the theory of imperfect technology is dismissed, we are left face to face with the chilling reality captured in these old photographs. The cities are indeed empty. But this is more than just silence. There is a sense of a recent but already concluded tragedy in the air. The landscapes do not resemble sleeping cities, but rather stage sets after the grand finale of a play, when all the actors have left and only traces of destruction remain on the stage. If we compare these images to photographs of cities that suffered during wars, such as World War I, the difference is stark. Military destruction leaves behind chaos, rubble from buildings, bomb craters, mountains of debris and wreckage, abandoned equipment. But amidst this chaos, there are always people, soldiers, refugees, residents trying to piece their lives back together. In the mysterious photographs of the 19th century, the picture is different. There is destruction, but of a different kind. And most importantly, there is a complete absence of the people who might have witnessed or participated in these events. The closest modern analogy might be Pripyat, a city abandoned overnight. But even there, in that frozen world, thousands of traces of human presence remain. Furniture in apartments, books on shelves, children's toys. The dead cities of the 19th century look different, as if they have been scoured clean, washed away. On the streets and squares of many of them, layers of mud, silt, and clay are visible. They bury the ground floors of buildings, hiding the cobblestones and sidewalks beneath them. In some places, there are standing pools of water, suggesting a recent flood or mudflow. It seems as though a gigantic wave or a powerful torrent of mud swept through these streets, carrying everything in its path: people, animals, carriages, market stalls, everything that made up the flesh and blood of city life. This flood didn't just carry away the living, it brought with it tons of earth and clay, burying the lower levels of civilization beneath it. The state of the vegetation adds another layer to the mystery. In cities where one would expect to see ancient trees, we either see none at all or only very young, thin, and frail saplings. They look as if they were planted very recently, perhaps just a few months or years ago, in bare, freshly cleared ground. This is completely inconsistent with the image of historic European capitals with their famous parks and avenues. It's as if some force not only washed away the people, but also destroyed all the long-standing flora, leaving behind a wasteland that is only just beginning to be reclaimed. This combination of factors, widespread mud, traces of water, and abnormally young vegetation, paints a coherent picture of a recent, global cataclysm of a water- or mud-based nature. The photos that show the first attempts at cleanup only reinforce this theory. In them, solitary figures appear, one or two people against the backdrop of a vast city. They don't look like native inhabitants. Rather, they appear to be workers or engineers engaged in digging out the buried structures. They stand before half-buried buildings, and their scale, compared to the grandeur of the architecture and the thickness of the mud layers, only emphasizes the magnitude of the disaster. This wasn't just a city that survived a flood. It was an entire world buried under a layer of clay, beginning its slow and arduous rebirth. In such a situation, with civilization effectively thrown back in time, survival and the restoration of basic infrastructure should have been the absolute priority. One would expect all resources to be directed towards building housing, repairing roads, and feeding the population. However, paradoxically, in this shattered and barely recovering world, a bizarre and widespread trend emerges, pointing to entirely different, almost mystical priorities of those who came to these desolate lands. In a world just beginning to recover from a global catastrophe, logic dictates that all efforts of the survivors should be focused on the most urgent tasks: ensuring safety, finding food, building temporary shelter, and restoring basic communications. Every brick, every working hand, every coin should have gone towards bringing life back to the deserted cities. However, as we study the historical chronicles and photographs of that period, we encounter a startling and baffling phenomenon. Against a backdrop of widespread desolation and traces of a recent cataclysm, observatories begin to appear or be restored all over the world, like mushrooms after the rain. These temples of science, designed for observing distant stars, somehow became a top priority in an era when it would have made more sense to watch your feet, not the sky. This phenomenon is perfectly illustrated by the case of Strasbourg. In 1870, as a result of the Franco-Prussian War, the city was subjected to horrific bombardments and was practically wiped off the face of the earth. Records and images survive, showing entire districts reduced to ruins. Not a single building was left intact. The humanitarian disaster was obvious. Thousands of people were left without shelter, food, and basic necessities. It would seem that all resources should have been directed towards rebuilding the city and helping the victims. But instead, one of the first and highest priority projects was the construction of a new, modern observatory. While people were huddled in temporary shelters amidst the ruins, someone deemed it absolutely essential to immediately erect a complex for observing astronomical bodies. This was not an isolated case. In many mid-19th century photographs showing desolate landscapes, a lack of vegetation, and traces of mudflows, observatories stand prominently in perfect condition. Two logical possibilities arise. Either they were just built on a cleared site, or they were the very first things to be restored immediately after the cataclysm. But both possibilities lead to the same question: why? For what purpose were colossal funds and efforts invested in astronomical research during such a hard time? Were knowledge of planetary movements and the composition of distant nebulae really that important to the people of a ruined world who were barely making ends meet? This priority seems so strange and illogical that it suggests a hidden, true reason for such zeal. Perhaps it wasn't about simple scientific curiosity. What if those who built these observatories were not watching the stars, but something else? What if, having survived one global cataclysm, perhaps one that came from space, they were intensely scanning the heavens, expecting it to happen again? In this context, the observatory transforms from a scientific institution into a strategic observation post, an early warning system. Or perhaps they were looking to the heavens not for a threat, but for a sign or a signal? Entire cities of stargazers, where the highest value was not earthly well-being, but celestial knowledge. It's a picture worthy of a science fiction novel. But the facts stubbornly indicate that this strange priority was a reality. This phenomenon, like the empty streets and the flood traces, is another piece of a giant puzzle. And to see how these pieces fit into a single, shocking picture, we must examine one particular city under a microscope. It is there, in the details that escape a superficial glance, that a key is hidden. One that can not only confirm our suspicions, but also expose a direct forgery in the official timeline of events. Among the many enigmatic photos of dead cities, there is a series of panoramic images of St. Petersburg that becomes a true stumbling block for official history and the key to the entire mystery. These images, attributed to the year 1861, display the same familiar scene: the majestic ensembles of Palace Square, St. Isaac's Cathedral, the Admiralty, all shrouded in an absolute, ringing emptiness. No people, no carriages, no signs of the bustling life of a capital city. At first glance, this is just another example of the inexplicable anomaly, one that could be filed alongside the empty streets of Paris or Rome. But hidden in the details of these St. Petersburg panoramas is an irrefutable piece of evidence, one that turns a mystery into proof of direct historical forgery. The evidence is the street lamps. In the photographs that historians confidently date to 1861, a very distinctive design of electric or gas lamps is clearly visible. These are not simple oil lamps, but more advanced lighting fixtures, part of a centralized city system. The problem is that according to all official documents and historical records, including data from publicly accessible sources like Wikipedia, lamps of this specific model were installed in St. Petersburg much later. Their installation on Palace Square and the surrounding streets was part of a major reconstruction and modernization of the city's lighting, which was only completed in 1876. This fact is easy to verify. Engravings and earlier images of the same locations, for instance from 1856, exist, and these lamps are not yet there. This discrepancy creates an unsolvable contradiction. If we believe the official date of the photograph, 1861, we must accept that the history of St. Petersburg's urban lighting is wrong, and that advanced technology arrived in the city 15 years earlier than is commonly believed. But if we trust the documented history of the lamp installation, the conclusion is even more shocking. The photograph could not have been taken in 1861. It was taken in 1876 or even later. And that changes the rules of the game completely. By 1876, photographic technology had advanced significantly. Exposure times became much shorter, and the sensitivity of emulsions increased. Photographers were not just able, but were commonly and easily capturing moving objects. There are thousands of photographs from the 1870s from all over the world depicting busy city streets, people walking, horses trotting, and boats sailing on rivers. Even if some moving figures still appeared slightly blurred, they were there, present in the images, filling them with life. If the panorama of St. Petersburg was taken after 1876, then technical limitations could no longer be the reason for the absence of people. The technology was there to capture them. And yet, they are still gone. The city remains utterly empty. Thus, the alibi of photographic technology, which was already shaky, is now completely destroyed. We are not dealing with a technical artifact, but with a documented reality. In the capital of the Russian Empire in the late 1870s, there were no people on the central streets. This discovery confronts us with two fundamental and deeply unsettling questions. First, why would anyone deliberately falsify the dating of these images, moving them back 15 years in time? What truth was this manipulation intended to hide? And second, if it wasn't about exposure time, where did all the people really go? What happened to this massive city that its central squares were lifeless, in an era when technology was already capable of documenting their presence? The answers to these questions can only be hypothetical, but they lead us to two possible and equally staggering scenarios for what is truly captured in these mysterious photographs. The realization that the empty streets of St. Petersburg in the late 1870s were not a technical glitch, but a documented reality, brings our investigation to a fork in the road. The facts we have gathered, lifeless cities, traces of a global cataclysm, the anomalous priority of building observatories, and proven forgery of dates, demand an explanation. At this point, two primary scenarios emerge. Two versions, each explaining the shocking picture in its own way, and each turning our understanding of the past on its head. Both suggest a massive event that was hidden or distorted in official history. The first version can be tentatively called the Progress Report. According to this hypothesis, we are not seeing cities before their desertion, but in the final stage of their restoration after it. What we mistake for ordinary 19th century life is actually the moment of a civilization's restart. A global cataclysm, perhaps the very mudflood whose traces are so evident, destroyed or forced out the previous inhabitants of these metropolises. The cities were buried in clay, silt, and sand, becoming silent ruins. Sometime later, new people arrived in these territories and began the massive work of clearing and restoration. The photographs, in this case, would be a kind of report on the completion of this titanic effort. This explains the sterile cleanliness of the streets. They have just been dug out and washed. It explains the absence of everyday objects. The new life has not yet begun. It also explains the abnormally young trees. They were planted in the cleared areas. The empty, tidied cities are ready for settlement. The panoramas show ships at anchor in the harbor. Perhaps they are not bringing goods, but building materials, furniture, food, and, most importantly, new inhabitants. These new residents may have been former peasants or migrants from other, less affected regions, who were tasked with occupying and inhabiting an infrastructure left behind by someone else. The lone figures in some photos are not residents, but engineers, administrators, or military personnel inspecting the work. The falsification of dates also makes sense in this scenario. It was necessary to erase the memory of the catastrophe and the time of emptiness, creating an illusion of a continuous, smooth history where the cities were always as they are and always belonged to those who now live in them. The second version is even more radical and can be called the Great Erasure. This hypothesis suggests that the cities weren't empty at all. On the contrary, they were full of life, but a kind of life that future generations were not meant to see. Perhaps the technological level of the previous civilization was significantly higher than is commonly believed. The streets may have been filled with trackless trams powered by an unknown energy source, or even horseless carriages, the ancestors of automobiles. The architecture and daily life might have included elements that would not fit into the later created picture of a backward era of steam engines and horse-drawn transport. According to this version, the photographs were subjected to deliberate and meticulous retouching. Not only the people, but also all inconvenient technological artifacts were erased from them. It was a colossal effort to sanitize the information field. Only the neutral background was left, the magnificent but safe architecture. Occasionally, to lend the images an air of authenticity and align them with the desired era, a few primitive horse-drawn carts might have been left in, or even painted on, to symbolize the technological level of the time. In this case, faking the dates also served to reinforce the desired historical paradigm. The goal of this global falsification was to hide the truth about the real level of development of the previous civilization, and, possibly, the reasons for its demise. Both of these versions, as different as they are, converge on one fundamental conclusion. They both lead us to the idea that the people we see in the rare, lively photographs of that era, in peasant clothes, on primitive carts, simply could not have been the builders of these grand cities. The scale and complexity of the architecture, the stone-cutting technologies, the engineering solutions realized in St. Isaac's Cathedral or the Alexander Column, are in glaring contradiction with the level of development that official history attributes to them. This brings us to the final and most important question. If not them, then who? Who was the true creator of this legacy? Both versions, the Progress Report and the Great Erasure, inevitably lead us to the same staggering conclusion. The magnificent cities captured in 19th century photographs were not built by the people in peasant smocks and horse-drawn carts that official history presents to us. The gap between their ascribed technological level and the reality frozen in granite and marble is too vast to be ignored. One need only look at the artifacts still standing in the center of St. Petersburg and other imperial capitals to understand that we are dealing with the legacy of a different, far more powerful and advanced civilization. Take, for example, St. Isaac's Cathedral. Its granite columns are not mere architectural elements. They are megaliths. Each one is carved from a single piece of granite, weighs around 110 tons, and is polished to perfection. Official history asks us to believe that these monoliths were quarried in Karelia, transported hundreds of kilometers by water, and then lifted and installed with pinpoint accuracy using primitive wooden structures and peasant ingenuity. Even today, with our steel cranes and powerful trucks, executing such a project would be an incredibly complex engineering feat. To believe it was done in the early 19th century with the means described is practically impossible. But the columns of St. Isaac's pale in comparison to the Alexander Column in Palace Square. This is no longer just a megalith. It is a marvel of engineering. A monolith of red granite, standing nearly 50 meters tall and weighing over 600 tons. It is not dug into the ground or secured by anything other than its own colossal weight. To raise such a giant to a vertical position is a task that boggles the mind. The technology capable of quarrying, shaping, transporting, and erecting such an object must have been orders of magnitude higher than what we are told about in history books. This is the legacy of a civilization that knew how to work with stone in ways we can't even manage with metal today. And there are countless such artifacts. Near the capital, in Pavlovsk Park, lies the so-called Tsar Bath, a perfectly carved bowl from a single piece of granite, over 5 meters in diameter and weighing 48 tons. The technology used to create it is completely lost to us today. All of these are silent witnesses, screaming that the official story of how these cities were built is a lie. But it's not just about technology. The symbolism adorning these monuments also raises many questions and points to the global rather than local nature of this vanished civilization. For instance, the Alexander Column is decorated not with traditional Russian double-headed eagles, but with so-called Hessian eagles, typical of European heraldry. And on its bas-reliefs, one can find an even stranger symbol, the all-seeing eye enclosed in a pyramid. This Masonic or esoteric sign has no place in the official Orthodox culture of the Russian Empire at the time. How did it end up in the very heart of the capital? This symbolism suggests the existence of a single, global elite or culture that ruled the world before the supposed cataclysm and left its marks on key monuments across the planet. Thus, the empty cities are just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath them lies the secret of a vanished, highly advanced civilization, which we might call an empire of giants. Not necessarily in a physical sense, but in the scale of their deeds and capabilities. They left us their cities as an inheritance, but their history was erased, replaced by a convenient and simplistic myth about a backward Russia that built it all with its bare hands. This conclusion, which begins with the simple question about empty photographs, seems incredible, almost fantastical. However, there may be other, even more direct and shocking pieces of evidence, still held under the classification of top secret in classified archives, waiting for their moment. Our journey, which began with the study of old faded photographs, has brought us to the threshold of an entirely different reality. One hidden behind the glossy cover of official history. The mysterious images of deserted 19th century cities are no longer just a technical quirk or a historical anomaly. They have become key pieces of evidence in a grand investigation, pointing to events of a truly planetary scale. These are not just pictures of the past. They are possibly the silent witnesses to a global catastrophe that wiped an entire civilization from the face of the Earth, and the subsequent reboot of history, carefully orchestrated and carried out by those who came after. We started with a simple question. Where did the people go? And step, by dismissing convenient but flawed explanations, we have arrived at conclusions that may seem shocking. We saw that the long exposure myth does not stand up to scrutiny when faced with facts and logical contradictions. We discovered clear traces of a worldwide cataclysm, layers of clay and silt that washed away the old world, leaving behind only the cleansed stone skeletons of cities. We encountered the inexplicable priorities of the survivors, or those who arrived on these lands, who first built observatories as if scanning the heavens for a threat or a sign. Finally, using St. Petersburg as a case study, we caught the forgers red-handed, proving that the dates of the photographs were deliberately altered to hide a gaping hole in the timeline. All these threads weave together into a single tapestry, revealing a picture of a world that has lived through an apocalypse. And the megalithic structures, like St. Isaac's Cathedral and the Alexander Column, serve as irrefutable proof that the civilization preceding ours possessed technologies that we are only beginning to comprehend today. Those who are presented to us as the builders of these empires were most likely just inheritors who settled in ready-made cities and were given a new, rewritten history. What we have examined is merely a prologue. A glimpse through the keyhole into a world that is hidden from us. This conclusion may seem fantastical, but it is based on facts and logic, not blind faith. And this is only the beginning. If we pull back the curtain of secrecy just a little further, we can find even more direct and astounding evidence. There are classified archives, including those of the KGB in the USSR, that contain information never intended for public eyes. In these top-secret documents lie reports of various archaeological discoveries that do not fit into mainstream science. We're talking about findings of giant skeletons, ranging from 6 to 11 meters in height, about sightings of unidentified flying objects, about the results of mysterious expeditions like Admiral Richard Byrd's mission to Antarctica, and about the technological riddles of the Third Reich. There are even entire projects dedicated to studying the flat Earth hypothesis, containing scientific arguments for this seemingly absurd idea. The world is far more complex and interesting than what we are taught in school. Therefore, the main goal of this investigation is not to provide ready-made answers, but to ask the right questions. To urge everyone not to take any version at face value, neither the official one nor the alternative. To urge you to think critically, to compare facts, to look for inconsistencies, and to explore the primary sources for yourselves. History is not a frozen monolith, but a battlefield where different forces fight for the right to shape our perception of the past, and therefore our future. Discover the world behind the scenes, and you may see a reality that surpasses the wildest imagination. True knowledge awaits those who are willing to seek it.